Hello, welcome to our keynote presentation, Foundations for Literacy. Hope it's been a great stimulating day for you, or actually 2 days now. We're nearing the very end of our symposium, and I hope you've had a great learning experience, as well as maybe made some new friends. I'm very pleased today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Amy Lederberg. Amy is a professor at Georgia State University in Atlanta and the director of the Center on Literacy and Deafness, also known as CLAD, C-L-A-D. CLAD has developed 5 educational interventions to improve language and literacy outcomes for children who are deaf and hard of hearing. Some are for children who use spoken language, while others are for those who use sign language. Dr. Lederberg is also has had a research award named after her at the university, and it's the Amy R. Lederberg Award for Outstanding Research in Educational Psychology, which is given to a new faculty member each year to support the development of their research agenda and recognize research-related accomplishments. And I threw that in because I think it's a wonderful testament to all that she has done and made in terms of contributions in training the future of the field. So without further ado, Amy, I will turn the microphone over to you.
Hi. And welcome. I'm very excited to be here and to share information about a curriculum that I've developed called Foundations for Literacy. I want to first acknowledge my development team. These are all the authors that work with me over the years to develop Foundations for Literacy. We have a lot of contributions from teachers. And so I want to acknowledge that this is actually a product of in-practice teachers who were intimately involved in the development. And also the U.S. Department of Education funded the development of this curriculum over years. We couldn't have done it without it. All right, so what is Foundations for Literacy? It's a fun, engaging, language-rich immersion literacy curriculum, and it's appropriate for 3 to 6-year-old deaf and hard of hearing children. When we developed it and implemented it, we had it as the language arts block of the school day. And so that was designed to be 1 hour a day for the school year. So we have lesson plans that cover what you would do for 1 hour a day for the school year. But we know in this world that is not what some practitioners have. And so we have, in fact, quite a lot of itinerant teachers who use it. They pull out what works for their students and have adapted it to a much more shorter time with the children. So Foundations for Literacy was developed by an interdisciplinary team. I want to just make sure you understand that we always had teachers of the deaf, both LSL teachers and ASL bilingual teachers involved in the development and in the implementation. So we have, our lessons are very much sensitive to the diversity of contexts that deaf children are acquiring language and literacy, and how their curriculum has to be adapted, the intervention has to be adapted to the language that of instruction. We also have involved speech pathologists, psychologists, researchers. If you can believe it, it took us 12 years to develop this curriculum. What we did was we designed lessons, then we went out and tested it in the classroom, then we revised the lesson plans based on that, and we did it over and over and over again, gradually starting with our research team teaching the lessons to classroom teachers to even more classroom teachers. So what I'm going to do today is review how we did that, show you a little snapshot of what Foundations looks like in the classroom, and then talk a little bit about how you can implement some of the practices in your classroom, even if you're not implementing Foundations for Literacy. Okay, so first we had 3 guiding principles as a framework when we developed Foundations. And I'm going to go through each one of them because they can be guiding principles for your own literacy practice. First, we began with research on what works for hearing children. There's been about 30 years of real intensive focus on how we can give hearing children a head start in literacy. In other words, developing early childhood education for hearing children, so especially low-income children can be more successful in school. So we wanted to use that rich research on what works for hearing children when we're developing something for deaf children, because we don't have anywhere near the amount of research and amount of information that we have had for hearing children. So first of all, let's back up. What is reading? Well, reading is amazing. You as an expert reader can quickly recognize words on the page. You can create meaning as you go along, as you read along, and you can learn that information from reading. Reading is critical for success. You can't be a student without it. And the problem with it is it's very complex. And in fact, not only is it complex, but it must be taught. So language is complex, but it's not something, except perhaps for deaf and hard of hearing children, that children get taught. But for reading, it's not natural. It's something we created as human beings, and it's something that it requires for the vast majority of students explicit instruction. And we're still struggling to figure out what that instruction should look like, but we've made progress over the last 20 years. So the first thing that I want to do when I review what we know from hearing children is to talk about reading theory. And the first theory is called the simple view of reading. And the reason why it's so powerful and is used probably the most often when we talk about reading is because it's simple. And so we taken a complex phenomena and made it simple so we as human beings can understand it. And so what the simple view of reading says is reading comprehension is the key to reading. After all, what we want to do when we read is understand what we read. And that in order to do that, you need two skills. One is you need to be able to recognize the print on the page. And the second is you have to have the language in order to understand what you read. So let's break that down a little bit more. So print word recognition is the connection between printed word and the spoken word or sign word, if that's what you use as your language. And usually there are like two ways that you can do that. One is called sight word recognition, which is what we as expert readers do. I look at this word and I say, oh, cat, and I know immediately that's what it is. But for early readers, or if you're reading a word that you don't know, what you do is you sound out or decode letters into sounds. So on this word, I would say, k, t. Now those are the sounds. And I can do that because I have the alphabetic knowledge to actually know that each one of those letters mean those sounds. And then I have to go, cat. I have to blend those sounds and create that word. And once I've said cat, I then link it to the meaning of the word cat. And so early readers do this. If you've ever sat through early readers reading, they do this with every single word and may need your help for the blending part of the operation. But eventually, after they've done it and they've matured, they can do it through sight word recognition. Okay. So that's the print word recognition component of reading that we have to do in order to read. And then there's the language part. Language comprehension is the ability to understand through the ear language, that is, whether it's spoken or signed. So here we have a sentence. The little girl is hugging the goat. We have to know girl, little, hugging, goat. We have to know all of that. And then once we put it together, we know that this is what it means. But we also know that the goat is being hugged by the little girl is the same meaning, even though it's a totally different structure. That's because we use our grammar to understand language. It's not just vocabulary, it's also grammar and background knowledge, knowing what hugging is, for instance. So the third thing I want to talk about with simple view of reading is that one of the things they said was it's not an additive relationship. You don't take a little bit of word recognition, a little bit of language, and then you get reading comprehension. No, it's a multiplicative relationship. And that means that both skills are necessary. You can't read without print word recognition. You can't, even if you have the best language, you can't read if you can't decode words. And that's what the problem with children with just classic dyslexia have, is that they don't have the phonological awareness skills to be able to learn to decode words, and therefore their print word recognition lags terribly behind their language comprehension, and their reading lags behind too. But there are some other children who are poor comprehenders who actually are quite good at recognizing words. They have phonological awareness, they can decode words, but when they decode the words and put them together and read them out, you say, what did you just read? And they're like, I don't know, because their vocabulary or their syntax or their background knowledge is lacking. So you need both skills. Now, that's a pretty simple view of the complex processes of reading. So we need to make it a little bit more complicated. And that is something that Hollis Scarborough presents, a really nice graphic that helps capture, again, in a fairly simplified way, what reading is. And so she uses a rope for her analogy. And she says, we're going to break this down into just like the simple view of reading. I said it was all over language comprehension and word recognition. But we're going to acknowledge that under each one of these, you really do have separate skills, as we've talked about before, and under decoding. But one thing the rope shows is that when you get to be a skilled reader, all of these separate skills get woven together and becoming very automatic. And skilled readers can do this quickly and accurately, and you don't have them separate. So they're all tightly woven together, even that all exist. And skilled readers can do all these things, but they don't exist separately. This is very different in the preschool child, which is what this rope is all about. In the preschool child, these things are pretty separate. So vocabulary, language comprehension is separate from word recognition. They're not woven in together. They are skills that are developing on their own. And over time, they get woven together. And so that means that if you're talking about a young child, you end up with learning objectives that are basically about all of these. But for older children, you may just target reading comprehension because that's the only thing that you're focused on is the outcome. And that all of these things come out of and contribute to that reading comprehension. And so you'll see with Foundations for Literacy, we have learning objectives that relate to almost all of these. And so we target them individually because we know they're not going to be existing as an integrated unit. I want to just point out one more thing about this, about Hollis Scarborough's slide, is that the jargon that we use in the reading research is that these things having to do with comprehension are called meaning-based skills, and these things, which have to do with being able to recognize words, are code-based skills. So you'll see that terminology throughout my talk. Okay, so what we took from all of that is that we said in Foundations for Literacy, we have to have two types of learning objectives. One is code-based skills, which are those that needed to break the code or read written words. And the other is meaning-based skills, which is what you need to understand the word, sentence, and connected text. So here are the learning objectives that we do in Foundations. Phonological awareness, which I think I've been throwing that word around and haven't defined it if you don't know it already. It's the ability to manipulate and think about the internal structure of words. In other words, the sounds of the words, which again, doesn't come naturally. We produce those sounds and children know how to produce most of those sounds, but they don't actually, once they produce cat, they actually don't know that cat has 3 sounds. So one of the things that early literacy programs do is they work on phonological awareness. So children become explicitly aware of the sounds of the language. So then they can decode those sounds when they read. Alphabetic knowledge, which turns out letter sound correspondence is much more important than letter name correspondence. So that's what we focus on. Word reading, letter sound fluency. This is taking that alphabetic knowledge and becoming fluent. And then we have lots of meaning-based objectives, vocabulary that's embedded in meaningful context, narrative, and storybook reading. Okay, so we just finished talking about how we took reading theory and integrated it in foundations. We also took instructional strategies that were integral to these effective early intervention programs for hearing children. So I'm just going to outline a few that we said, okay, we need this in our curriculum. You always have to create clear instructional goals. Your activities have to be fun and engaging. After all, we're talking about 4-year-olds. They don't want to sit down and be lectured at. Have repeated practice within those fun activities. Teachers have to prompt children to be actively participating. One of the worst things about classrooms for deaf and hard of hearing children may be that teachers take too large a role and not have children practice enough. So we have to build into the curriculum ways in which they prompt children's active participation. Teachers always expand on children's answers once they're participating so they can build on the language that the children are using. And teachers also scaffold responses. I'm going to expand on that last one because it's something that most of you may be aware of, but I just want to, it's a pretty effective way of doing scaffolding. And you'll see it when you see the videos that this is used a lot by our teachers. The first thing when you introduce a skill is you model the target response. This is the I do part, the teacher does it. And then she prompts the children to do it with her. So choral reading and imitation. And finally, she hands over control to the child and prompts the children to do it individually. It's important to go through all this so children are successful and doing the right response, but they're also actively participating. All right, so that's the stuff we learned from hearing curriculum and looking at hearing curriculum. But now we wanted to adapt what we actually started this. Our original grant was to take a hearing curriculum that was successful called Literacy Express and adapt it for deaf children. But once we looked at the curriculum, we got the money, we looked at the curriculum, we wanted to see our kids and we're like, wait a second, this won't work. We'll just rewrite the whole thing. So we said, okay, we're going to start from scratch. And that's how we ended up with our own curriculum. And what we need to do is take the principles, but then adapt it to the special needs of deaf kids. And so what are those special needs? Well, clearly, many deaf children have a language delay. And so in order to address that language delay, we first start out the year using explicit instruction of instructional language. What do we mean by that? Well, when we get to phonological awareness, sometimes we ask children to break apart a word, but they may not know what break apart means. So we start our year with puzzles where we break the puzzles apart and we put them back together. So they actually have the vocabulary down of the instruction for when they're focusing on our literacy objectives. We embed all instruction in language-rich contexts. It's really critical that language is the important thing for deaf and hard of hearing preschoolers. And so we don't want to have isolated instruction on literacy. We actually integrate it so the kids don't know we're teaching literacy while they're doing lots of fun language activities. We also use known vocabulary in phonological awareness activities. One thing that was really striking to us when we looked at other standalone phonological awareness instructional packages for hearing kids, and also as part of Literacy Express, was that the vocabulary used in those phonological awareness activities were not necessarily known by deaf kids. And so when they're trying to figure out what the initial sound of a word is, they should know what those words are. So it's not a vocabulary lesson, it's a phonological awareness lesson. And so what we do is we take the vocabulary that the children have learned in earlier weeks and put that into our phonological awareness activities. So it is, the focus is on the sounds, the language of known words, which makes it easier. Also, one of the things, all right. So a second major thing that we do for deaf kids is due to the fact that hearing loss weakens speech perception by definition, and it also means that deaf and hard of hearing children, phonological representation of words is usually weaker and less fine-tuned. And therefore needs to be supported through other modalities. And so this is what we call the triangle in memory research, and it's important for memory for hearing kids too. But I would say it's really important for deaf kids. So it's that every representation should be done with phonology, like the sounds of the words, visual, which is the what it looks like, and semantic, or meaning. And you need all three of these things, even when it's not normal to have that or typical to have that. So how do we see this in foundations? Okay, one, when we're teaching vocabulary, we don't just say the word and then, let it go on. We make sure that when we're targeting vocabulary, which we urge teachers to do every week, is we have three components. We have the phonological, which is of course saying the word, but we also add a picture so the kids have something to keep in mind when you're saying the word. And we add a child-friendly definition. And I'm going to say that over and over again, because one thing in our research of observations, teachers of the deaf, that we found is teachers that use more child-friendly definitions have kids whose vocabulary and syntax grows more. And this is outside of foundations. This was actually in kindergarten through second grade. So what's a child-friendly definition? Well, of course, I can't think of a word, but let's say soar. The bird soared through the air. Soar, that means they go really high and fast. So you've inserted naturally into the discourse some definition that the child can hang on to. And we also add meaning to our letter sound correspondences. So typically what we're trying to teach children when they're learning initial alphabetic knowledge is they need to know the letter, which is visual, right? And they need to know the sound. So M says and usually that's all that kids get. Or they might say M is M is like mom. And so they get a word, and that's semantic. They get a word in which the letter is the initial sound. Now we said, okay, but in order for children to be successful with using mom, they actually have to have the phonological awareness skill of isolating that sound from the word. And so we present a novel way of teaching letter sound correspondence that turns out that all of our kids learn, is by embedding that sound into a semantic context. So the sound itself becomes meaningful. And then that meaning can be associated to the letter. And I'm going to show you lots of examples of this later on, but it is something that's different from most interventions. Okay, narrative is the other thing we work on. We have telling the story, we have picture sequence cards that are illustrating the story, and then of course we have the story itself, which is inherently meaningful. Okay, so the third principle that we have when we develop foundations is we wanted to individualize it to meet the needs of particular children. You know that deaf and hard of hearing children have a huge amount of individual differences, much more than hearing children. And perhaps the most challenging thing teachers of the deaf and speech pathologists have when they do intervention with deaf children is to meet the needs of the particular child you're teaching, especially if you have a classroom of deaf children. You may have one child who has a language of a 2-year-old and another child who is age appropriate. So one of the things we do in our lessons is we give hints on all of our activities of how you would do this for children who are early or just starting that skill versus those who are age appropriate or maybe beyond. And we actually call them sprouts, buds, and blooms. Sprouts are, as it says, are those who are just starting. You can have a 3-year-old in this project and you realize, I'm not going to do all this letter sound correspondence. I'm just going to introduce them. We have our buds who are a little higher than the sprouts, but still in the beginning, and then we have our blooms. And so the teacher doesn't have to figure out, how do I adapt this lesson? We give them that information in our lesson plans. So what are the ways in which we would have to individualize that we do in our lesson plans? One is levels of language, which I just mentioned. We present for all of our lessons, we have 4 different levels of vocabulary. The first 3, we actually provide pictures for them so they can have that visual representation of the words, not just the semantic of age definitions and the word itself. We also present choices and teach our teachers to make sure that they individualize what they're expecting out of the child so all children can be successful. So you probably are aware of this technique where you present a closed set of choices to children who are just starting out. So is the initial first sound of milk or t? Which is it? Versus saying to the child, tell me the first sound of milk, where the child has to generate themselves. That's an open set. Sometimes we expect the child to just imitate. This is frequently the case when they're reading a word. Let's say me, I may say, okay, listen to me. Me. Okay, now it's our turn. We'll do it together. Me. And now it's your turn if they're at that point. Or we may say, read this word and have the child do it. Visual support. Visual support is something that for some deaf kids, they don't need it. But for many deaf kids, they need more visual support. So we make sure that the teachers know where they can get that kind of visual support. For example, I already told you we provide pictures, and phonological awareness is an interesting skill where some I've seen written up that some people think it should only be auditory, but the truth is that deaf children get a lot more support from letters and other visuals and can hear things better if they have those visual supports. So we give hints on how that can be done in the curriculum. Foundations for, I told you, it took us 12 years to develop it, and we did research for another couple of years. So because we're scientists, and the government demands it, we have extensive research on the effectiveness of foundations. We have single case studies, group comparisons, and a randomized control trial. You can find this research is downloadable on our website. And I just want to talk a little bit, highlight a few findings so you can show that. By the way, it does, we do meet the criteria of what Works Clearinghouse on effectiveness, and so it is an evidence-based curriculum. Okay, so this is from one study. We gave standardized tests, standardized on hearing children, to our students who were participating. And we did it in vocabulary, phonological awareness, and word reading and alphabetic knowledge. And what we found was that children started the year below average, which isn't surprising. So these are standardized tests with a mean of 100, and 85 is the cutoff to be in the normal or typical range. And our kids were lower on phonological awareness and on vocabulary, not surprising. They were actually knew their letter names, so they're on target in the initial items on this one. But look what happened after we taught foundations to them. They increased their standard scores by more than 10 points. Now, standard scores typically don't go up. They're meant to be standardized by age, which meant that for the average hearing child, they'll stay at the same time, same level across the years. But we didn't do that. We accelerated learning. So kids who were below average in vocabulary became within the average range. And on phonological awareness, which is a skill that really, really deaf kids struggle with, they ended up in this red bar. Is a little bit high. 88 is within the normal range. And they even increased in word reading to above average. So we're excited. We conducted, in the last year we were doing development and research, we conducted a randomized control trial. We were in 14 states and had 48 teachers participating. Teachers were randomly assigned to either teaching foundations or not teaching their typical curriculum. And we had over 240 kids being tested. That's what's being measured here. So once a teacher was randomized into foundations, obviously the students in their classroom were in the intervention group. And what you're seeing here are graphs that depict how much the children learned over the school year. So this is technically, this is their spring raw scores, no longer standard scores, raw scores, controlling for where they were in the fall. And what the important thing is that this bar, the intervention bar, is a little taller than the blue bar, which means that kids taught with foundations made significantly more progress in phonological awareness than kids taught in their typical curriculum. And that's true also with letter sound knowledge and with being able to decode words. So we're pretty excited about that. We didn't replicate the improvement on reading, on vocabulary, but that's because both control and intervention kids improved on vocabulary. And when we looked at the control classrooms, the intervention classrooms, both groups were doing some of the things the same. They both were targeting vocabulary. They were doing what's called dialogic reading, which I will describe in a minute. And so they looked like they were both facilitating vocabulary. Okay, we also surveyed the teachers, and luckily all but one said, yeah, I love it. I'm going to use it again. My students benefited, so the teachers loved it. Another somewhat surprising, when we went out recruiting these classrooms, we took any teacher who was willing to be part of this. And so we had kids who were in LSL classrooms, private schools, public schools, rural schools, urban schools, as I said, 14 states, but 40% of the kids were also in classrooms with hearing kids. So they were integrated classrooms, and the teachers used foundations to teach both groups of kids. And so the teachers said that their hearing children benefited from the curriculum too. So it's perfectly appropriate because we have all of that individualization to use it for hearing kids with disabilities or without disabilities, and also deaf kids, which is good since a lot of deaf kids are integrated now with hearing kids. Okay, so now I'm going to spend the rest of the talk showing you foundations in action. So I said that we teach letter sound correspondence by embedding that sound in a story called a Miss Giggle story. Every week has a Miss Giggle story, and we have a scope and sequence with that Miss Giggle story. And Miss Giggle is about an after-school teacher, Miss Giggle, and 3 children who attend the after-school. And so this first story is about Miss Giggle making sundaes, and it's about the letter M. One day, Miss Giggle said, "Let's make sundaes." Kate said, I love sundaes. Pete said, me too. And so you can read the rest yourself. And in the end, Kate said, Miss Giggle said, "The letter M makes the M sound." And she wrote the letter M on a card and stuck it on the box. So this is a story that the teacher reads. And by the way, we have 2 versions of the story, a lower language version and a higher language version, depending on the kids in your classroom. They have story sequence cards, which you'll see the teacher lays out. And we have vocabulary. And our vocabulary, the teacher has to choose what's appropriate for their children. And we use these stories to both fit our learning objectives that are code-based and meaning-based. So let's first talk about code-based instruction. We have alphabetic knowledge and phonological awareness. And one thing this story does is create that meaningful association for the letter. So we show this when they say, that's the letter, that's the sound the letter M makes. We show this card to them so they get introduced to the letters M. But we also have an icon which is used as a mnemonic cue or a memory cue to recall the sounds. This is E. A little girl goes E down the slide, and now we have E, and you'll see the kids can read this much. It's the beginning of being able to read words. They gradually get to that, but this means that it's meaningful. It's something they automatically can do. All right. In addition, we use the Miss Giggle story as a bridge for a lot of meaning-based activities. They participate in a language experience related to the Miss Giggle story. So as soon as you read the story, they go, oh, we're going to make ice cream sundaes. And they plan what they need to make ice cream sundaes. They do a shopping list. They can use their vocabulary. They then make ice cream sundaes, and they say, that's good. And then after all, they recall that ice cream sundaes. This provides lots of opportunity to practice vocabulary and literacy activities that you'll see in the videos I'm going to show you. Okay, so now we're on to videos. And this is a Miss Giggle story about racing and the letter R. Here's just some vocabulary cards that the teacher has access to, and you'll see how nicely she weaves. This is the first reading of the story, and she'll weave the letter sound cards and, the vocabulary cards and the sequence cards. Here she is.
And Kate and Sue ran into Miss Giggle's house, and Pete said, look, our teacher gave us some prizes today. At school. And the children pulled out their race cars from their backpacks. They are at Miss Giggle's house. So Kate began to push her race car around the room, and she pretended to have a race, and she said, as she pushed the car. And Miss Giggle said, let's all have a race. And she put a piece of tape down on the floor, and she said, put your cars here. This is where the race will start. And she put another piece of tape down on the floor and said, this will be the finish line. The first car to the finish line wins the race. Yep. So Pete and Kate and Sue pushed their cars. Sue's car was the first car to the finish line, and she said, I win. I know. Good job, said Miss Giggle. When you pushed your cars, you said, and the letter R makes the sound too.
All right, so after you do that, you're going to do a planning activity. I'm just going to show a brief clip. This is of a different week, just so you can see how they use vocabulary cards and use it as a way in which to also practice authentic writing.
Bake a cake. Yes. We're going to bake a cake. We need to make a plan. Let's see. Yep, Miss Parker will be here.
But what about you?
What, me? Oh, I know, so sad. So we are going to make a plan about baking.
Cake.
Mm-hmm.
Delicious. Like, what's the plan? Roll it.
Lilia.
Yummy cake.
Time to say, okay. What do we need?
A batter.
I want you to raise your hand. Tell me, what do we need in order to make a cake?
know.
Aaron.
We need a batter.
We do need batter. Batter is one of our words, but you know what? Batter is when you've already mixed some stuff together.
And we need a pan.
Well, what do you mix together to make batter?
A mixed cake.
We need cake mix. So, all right. We need what?
A cake. And we need 3 eggs.
Grab this.
Okay.
You think we need 3 or 4 eggs?
No. 3 eggs. 3 eggs. That's right.
All right. So next I want to share with you where they're doing the activity, but the activity has to do with a tea party. I'm going to give you a second to read this, especially the end of it. So you can see that this is about the letter U, and it's a way in which to get the kids to say the sound And now I'm going to see this great activity that the teacher did with her class.
All right, I will try to lift the sugar. Ah, my hat fell off. Oh, I can't do it. Nate, will you try to lift the sugar?
I think it's too heavy. I think it's too heavy.
Listen to Nate. He said,
That's a new sound.
Jaden. That is so heavy. Jaden, can you lift it? Almost did it, Nate.
Not giving up till it's done.
It's too hard. Joshua, will you lift the sugar? What did he say? Listen.
You do it. Pick it up. All right, so that is the do part. This clearly isn't as language rich as other activities, but it's a great way for them to isolate that sound and create that semantic association. And then at the very end, they do a recall of the activity.
Yesterday, we did something. Yeah, we did. We made a plan, and we had a race. Look, we had a race. And another way to have a race is to have a running race. Run, 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 run.
And the red card.
Yes,
With
run,
the
run,
red
run.
card. Tomorrow.
All right. So
Tomorrow.
this is called recall.
Red card.
Recall.
Look.
So
Red
I
card.
want you to think.
I think I'm wrong.
We had a starting line. We had a finish line. It's there on the floor. Somebody won. They were the winner. We pushed the car.
All right, so I said that we use these activities to do both meaning-based, which is what, and code-based. This is how the kids learn to read words using those little icons that were represented by these semantic associations.
Albert, I have a sound here. Let's see if you know it. Here we go. Grrr. Nikki knows it. Ready? Nikki knows it. Grrr. Nikki knows it. All right, so we're going to say run, 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 run.
So these kids have no problems knowing what those sounds are and then blending them together. It takes a little work, but they got there. All right, here's a more advanced group of kids, and the teachers are playing, and this is an advanced phonological awareness skill. Think about the skills these kids have on taking words apart and putting them back together.
Look, what are we going to do with this? What do we do with this? We're going to make some words. We're going to use our sounds.
I'm going to make a cake tomorrow.
Let me see. I'm going to try and do this first. Let's see. This word is cake. Amelia, sit up. I think if I put these together, That should be right. Let's see. I'll use a picture. Let's see. I'll sound this out. Lily, I think I got it. You ready? Okay. Bake.
No.
No? What's wrong?
It's fake.
That's not cake? What should we change? What would make it cake? What could we do?
This one.
Where should we put it? Okay. Let's try it.
Egg.
B. K. Abe. Cabe.
No.
What's wrong?
Egg. Cake.
Ah!
So we're thrilled that kids can get that there by using these, their great memory of these sounds and taking it apart and putting it together. All right, so what else we do? We have phonological awareness. We teach rhyming, syllable segmentation, initial phoneme isolation, or the beginning sounds of words. Here's back to Nikki in class using that.
You're fine. Nikki, you see 3 sounds. What's this one?
A.
Look again. E. Good. All right. Are you ready?
Yeah.
All right. Here's a picture of some teeth. Does that start with a a t, or e? Think about what's it start with? Think about it. Teeth. Oh, it goes right there. Thank you, Nikki. Teeth. Say teeth. Teeth. Good job. You did it, Nikki. Thank you, sir. All right, let's now do Albert. Albert. Wow, we give you a lot of choices.
That's true.
We give Albert a lot of choices. All right, ready, Albert?
Yeah. And if we buy my perfume.
All right, here you go, Albert. What is it?
Pizza.
All right, where does it go?
B.
Thank you, Albert.
And you notice how she differentiated her instruction with the 2 kids. All right, because we don't want them reading just isolated words and not understanding what they're reading and building meaning and knowing that that's the point of reading, we include lots of different reading connected text. We have books that we've created. We have sentences of the week. And I'm going to show you. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to do this quickly.
All right, so it says, I see a
Hi.
note.
No.
I see a note. Very good. Who wants to read it first?
Me.
Okay. E C
Goat.
Whoa, did you hear her?
Yeah.
She read that. She said, I see a note. Note. I see a note. Your turn. All right, tell me this word again. Has. Has. Do you see has? Do you see it in that sentence? Is he right? Is he right? Is that has?
Yes.
Has. Has. Is he right?
Yes.
Yeah, he's right. Good job. Let's see if we can read this sentence. Who wants to try first?
Me.
Okay, Daniel said me first, so I'm going to let him try.
Eat. Wait.
Very good. Pete.
Had a car.
Very good. Pete has a tie. Let's see if he's right. Let's see if the picture matches. Is he right? Show them. Let them see. Let them see if you're right. Is that?
You can see that we show a picture, but not until after they've read, so they can check their comprehension. Again, driving the point that we're about understanding what you've read and not guessing. All right, so putting it all together, we also engage in storybook reading, which is dialogic reading. I'm going to really quickly go over this since I've run out of time. You read the same book 3 or 4 times a week. What you start with is selecting vocabulary that children don't know. You can see here the words from the book that the children don't know. And then the definitions, creating child definitions, creating pictures that go with those words, and sometimes creating sticky notes with possible questions. You read the same book 4 times so the children can really know the book and answer questions and participate and talk about that book. The first time you read it, you embed child-friendly definitions. Then you ask children questions and answer them sometimes yourself because they may not know the answer. And then the third and fourth, you pull language out of the child. I want to just tell you that this is a very popular, effective way of reading that increases vocabulary for both hearing and deaf children. And you can find lots of resources online on how to do it. I clearly didn't spend enough time on it, but I'm just giving you these resources. Okay, so Foundations for Literacy has a balance of code focus and meaning focus. It's widely implemented across the US. We are in 45 of the 50 states. We have a UK version and it's being developed for Australia. You can receive training virtually in July and August. We offer that every year. And you have to be trained in order to buy the curriculum, which is full of stuff listed here. I also want to let you know that even if you don't want to do foundations or you're not in a position to do foundations, I have created effective practices lists that is in a handout under resources and also in the article in Volta Review that you can incorporate into your own practice. Here's our contact information. Stacy Chuchu, you saw under the reading, is a co-author and our lead trainer. And this is under the auspices of the Center on Literacy and Deafness, where we have other interventions listed on our website. And I believe I'm done. That's it.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Dr. Lederberg. That was a very wonderful presentation, and the audience has been very engaged throughout. And we have a lot of questions that I know we won't get through all of them, but I'm going to see how many we can get through for our audience. So this is one of the earlier questions, and it said, could you please clarify the difference between your definition of alphabetic knowledge and phonological awareness?
So alphabetic knowledge has to do with letters. So it's letter names, letter sound correspondence. Phonological awareness just has to do with the sounds of words and being aware that words are made up of sounds. Now, the way we teach it, and I actually think is a better way, is to integrate the two. So you may have noticed that we do a lot of word reading with our little sound cards because that provides the visual support that deaf kids need in order to be able to blend and hear the different words, different sounds in the language. And I have to say some of this has to do with personal experience, anecdotal evidence, but I am personally have a severe hearing loss. And I actually spent time in Switzerland when I was a college student, learning French and going to school in French and not with hearing aids. So I was a disaster. And what I did, though, was able to take the words of French that I visualized in my mind and understand what the teacher was saying by using that kind of visualization. So that's sort of off the topic, but there you go.
Another question. How do you go about teaching specific phonemes that some kiddos might not hear or have access to?
Well, again, I think the way to do it is to provide that semantic association and the letters. So the kids can hear something and they can distinguish using that visualization and the meaning to separate what little they can hear. The other thing is there are tools like visual phonics, which we encourage teachers to use if their kids can't hear. I think if the kids can't hear at all, there are alternatives like fingerspelling that are better alternative support.
Terrific. What age level is the Miss Giggles series of stories aimed for?
The whole curriculum is aimed for, the target age is 4. We have classrooms with 3-year-olds, but we also have them being used with older kids who are catching up and are functioning at the age of a 3 or 4-year-old.
Terrific. Did the graphs that you shared, did that include kids with typical hearing, or was it just kids who were deaf or hard of hearing?
Just kids who are deaf and hard of hearing.
It's very impressive growth. I know you were very pleased to see that.
Yeah.
Does the program address the connection between reading and writing? And then the second part is, how or is spelling and orthographic knowledge covered?
Not as well as I'd like to. So we started this 14 years ago when, although writing was around, it wasn't something that most preschool programs addressed. Since then, there's been more research that shows that writing is an important part of literacy. So we've added material that teachers can supplement all of these things with a writing activity, but we don't explicitly teach writing in the curriculum.
Can speech pathologists in a clinic-based setting receive training on this, or
Yes.
is it just for teachers?
Nope, anybody can receive if you just need to show up. Register and show up.
How often is a new letter or sound introduced?
Once a week is typical. Some weeks we introduce 2, and we go through all the letters of the alphabet and all the sounds. So it's organized around sounds. So we have long A and short A, but on different weeks. This is just an example.
Okay. I'm checking our time. I think we have time for another question or two. You mentioned that children with hearing loss have weak speech perception. Do you have stratified baseline data that looked at correlation between phoneme perception in quiet and in noise with reading competency variables?
I don't.
I
don't. It would be very interesting. We did all of our research in the schools, so we didn't have access to sound booths or anything, but I would love, that sounds like a great study to do.
Yeah. You mentioned that the program includes children who use ASL. Are they children who still have auditory access?
So as part of my Center on Literacy and Deafness, we've delved a lot into this separately from, first of all, I should say Foundations isn't for it. We adapt it and we provide resources. Usually it's teachers teaching ASL kids versus teachers teaching LSL. They're not in the same classroom. So, but it's certainly true that some signing programs have quite a number of kids who have access to sound. And so our experience is that teachers have various approaches and we don't prescribe that. You could approach those kids who have access to sound differently from the kids who don't have access to sound. We would urge that. We have evidence from our other research that shows that kids who have access to sound, even if they're in voice-off signing environments, learn to read through spoken language. And so for part of their reading instruction, it would be good to do that. But for kids who don't hear, we tried to teach them spoken phonemes. It didn't work very well. And so we have switched to an approach using fingerspelling.
Great. One of the questions that came in said that the M symbol was the same visual as the vocabulary word for ice cream sundae. How do you explain that is not the beginning sound for the vocabulary word?
I'm not sure that's true. What you might have been seeing is our icon for but I'd have to go back and see. So I'm looking. I know you can't see it, thank God. But we don't, so our picture of ice cream is different from ice cream sundae. The ice cream sundae you saw is our icon for and I think it's not a vocabulary card.
It's good.
Right.
Okay. So I noticed that like some of the sounds had to do with what the object, something to do with the object, like picking up heavy sugar. So that makes sense.
Right. I mean, so I think traditionally as adults, we're used to hearing the R like race. So that some of our association includes the word, but most of them don't. And that is a unique approach. And you saw those kids decoding the like run, they got it. You know, for adults, like, what is that sign? What is that picture? And they know it immediately, more quickly than letters, though we spent a lot of time getting them to know letters too.
Perfect. Well, that is all the time we have.
Okay.
Thank you so much. This was a great presentation.
Thank
Great
you.
audience participation, and we really appreciate you joining us for the Listening and Spoken Language Symposium.
Thank you. I hope you all had a great conference.
Thank you.